Early on the morning of December 19th, Donald Trump pivoted to insurrection, tweeting out, "Be there, will be wild," about January 6th. And the MAGA media responded.
Meanwhile, other key Trump supporters, including far-right media personalities, began promoting the wild protest on January 6th.
It's Saturday, December 19th. The year is 2020. And one of the most historic events in American history has just taken place. President Trump, in the early morning hours today, tweeted that he wants the American people to march on Washington, D.C. on January 6, 2021.
And now Donald Trump is calling on his supporters to descend on Washington, D.C., January 6th.
He is now calling on we, the people, to take action and to show our numbers.
We're going to only be saved by millions of Americans moving to Washington, occupying the entire area, if necessary, storming right into the Capitol. You know, we know the rules of engagement. If you have enough people, you can push down any kind of a fence or a wall.
This could be Trump's last stand. And it's a time when he has specifically called on his supporters to arrive in D.C. That's something that may actually be the big push Trump supporters need to say, this is it. It's now or never.
You better understand something, son. You better understand something. Red wave, bitch. Red wave. This is going to be a red wedding going down January 6th.
On that day, Trump says, show up for a protest. It's going to be wild. And based on what we've already seen from the previous events, I think Trump is absolutely correct.
Motherfucker, you better look outside. You better look out January 6th. Kick that fucking door open. Look down the street. There's going to be a million plus geeked up armed Americans.
The time for games is over. The time for action is now. Where were you when history called? Where were you when you and your children's destiny and future was on the line?
Good morning and welcome to the Bulwark podcast. I am Charlie Sykes. Our guest this morning, the morning after, my colleague, Bill Kristol. Good morning, Bill.
Good morning, Charlie.
So yesterday, once again, even for those of us that have been immersed in Donald Trump's attempted coup, I thought the committee laid out a very, very stark timeline of what happened, centering on Donald Trump's tweet on December 19th, which, by the way, came about, a little more than an hour, hour and a half, after the most insane, unhinged meeting ever in the Oval Office, where Sidney Powell and Michael Flynn and Rudy Giuliani were arguing about, various other options for Trump to stay in power, including the possibility of the military seizing voting machines, naming Sidney Powell special counsel. And apparently when Donald Trump realized that he wasn't going to get support from his White House aides, he decided that he was going to unleash the mob. And he put out that tweet. And I thought it was rather extraordinary the way they documented, the way that the MAGA media immediately recognized that this was a call to action. I thought they did a really powerful job of connecting these dots. What are your thoughts?
I agree. I'm just listening to those clips. I felt sort of physically sick, I've got to say, which is what I felt on January 6th, watching what was happening at the Capitol, a few miles away from where I live here in Northern Virginia, a place I've been many times, obviously, as you have. And just seeing that happen at the U.S. Capitol, and then being reminded that all these people were exulting in the thought of it happening, makes me feel a little bit sick and depressed about our country. But again, I come back, why were we never Trump? This is like, I don't want to obsess about this, but why were we so much against Trump? Because having a demagogue like Trump as president takes what's already, a bunch of people who are not just irresponsible, but a little crazed and prone to violence and so forth. But every country has, and the U.S. has had in its history, the Proud Boys, the Oath Keepers, the rabble-rousers, the people who are looking for an excuse almost to use violence. What we haven't had is a demagogue as president who will think nothing of unleashing them. It's about Trump at the end of the day. It's not about the Proud Boys and the Oath Keepers, and that's why we were never Trump. And I don't want to, I'm not
Yeah.
patting myself on the back at all. Quite the contrary. This is why it was serious. This is why it wasn't about the tweets. It wasn't because he was a little more protectionist on economic policy than I liked. It wasn't because he, was against foreign policies that I supported or insulted people. It wasn't even that he insulted people. That gets to a little bit of his character and what he would do to our politics. Having a totally unprincipled demagogue as president is very dangerous, and it was very dangerous, and the danger culminated on January 6th.
And the fact that the possibility of violence was always there. In one of the sound bites, one of the voice you heard is some guy named Salty Cracker who says, better understand something. Red wedding. There's going to be a red wedding going down on January 6th. As Jamie Raskin explained later, red wedding he described it as a pop culture reference to mass slaughter. Anybody that watched Game of Thrones knows that it's not just pop culture. It's a very, very specific reference to a very, very violent moment. And you put this together with all of the other things that we now know about Donald Trump on January 6th, the fact that he ordered that the mags be taken down, that even though he'd been informed that there were weapons, his plans to march on the Capitol, the fact that there were these unsent tweets signaling that he was going to make this unexpected announcement, but somehow the seditionists know. I guess the point is, all of the rationalizations that we have heard that, oh, Donald Trump didn't mean it, he didn't know, it was spontaneous, one by one, they are being knocked down and destroyed by this committee. And yet, of course, there are still the turd polishers out there who will do the best to minimize the gravity of what happened.
Yeah, I mean, he tried to use the federal government to subvert the election, the Justice Department in particular, Defense Department as well, the White House staff. He tried to pressure state officials and state legislators, and then he unleashed the mob. He was hoping that any or all of them would work, obviously. And the degree to which people, of course, your typical conservatism Inc., establishment conservatives, National Review, Wall Street Journal, et cetera, types, members of Congress even, they're not crazy about nominating Trump again, so they'd prefer it would be DeSantis or someone else. But they voted for Trump. They supported Trump. I asked this question seriously, not even rhetorically. Has any of them just said that was wrong? Has any of the 147 members who voted to overturn the election results, apologized for doing
One
so?
of them, just one.
Is that one?
Yeah,
I mean,
it's one.
I was struck. Someone reminded me of this the other day, and you and I have discussed this. Like Senator Cruz and Hawley on January 1st or 2nd, I think it was. They were the ones who kind of gave a lot of impetus to this because they said they would object. And before that, it was just House members, and people thought they maybe couldn't even get a senator, so it wouldn't even get to kind of to Pence's level, as it were. And the whole thing seemed a little bit of a desperate kind of rump thing. Then you have two prominent senators, joined by I think 7 or 8 others. I think there were 9 of them, maybe, saying we're going to object. And then Hawley famously encourages the crowd on the morning of January 6th with that clenched fist salute. For me, that's the image that one has to keep in mind. Important Republican senators, some of them kind of heroes to part of the right, encourage this mob action. I wouldn't say National Review and Wall Street Journal encouraged it, but they certainly minimized its importance and certainly didn't rethink their attachments because of it, and have since spent most of their time attacking the January 6th committee. That's the other thing, incidentally. Is anyone who was against the January 6th committee going to say, you know what? They've actually discovered a heck of a lot of important material, and they've presented it in a responsible way, and they haven't violated anyone's civil rights, and it's been a benefit to the country. I haven't heard that from the Wall Street Journal or National Review or any of the huge percentage of Republican senators and members of Congress who voted against it.
Well, let's go back to this overriding point about this is who Donald Trump always was. That Donald Trump was never going to concede this election. He was never going to admit he was defeated. And again, you and I have talked about this. We've read about this. We've talked about this endlessly, and yet it still felt very vivid yesterday with this timeline that there is Donald Trump who's been informed over and over and over again that there is no fraud, there is no way, it is over. His Department of Justice says, that there was not sufficient fraud to overturn the election. The Electoral College actually votes on December 14th. His own counsel tells him it is over, the election is done. And yet he is so desperate to cling to power that he's willing to do anything. So he brings in this absolutely deranged group of conspiracy theorists. into the Oval Office, and there was this meeting that took place that lasted for more than 6 hours past midnight, with the shouting and the screaming and, participants who nearly come to blows, all of it designed to come up with some sort of a scheme to give him another term in office, in power, after he has lost the election. And I guess it hadn't really dawned on me that he leaves this meeting, and it was that night that he put out the "Be Wild," "Be there, will be wild" tweet, that he decided that he was going to make this particular pivot. I mean, I thought that was extraordinary. But I have one more thing I wanted to play for you, Bill. To this question of this is who Donald Trump was, he was never going to acknowledge that he was defeated, that this is not just a contingent set of events that just sort of happened. This is deeply ingrained in Donald Trump's character. The folks over at Mother Jones have obtained this, I think, absolutely fascinating audio tape of Steve Bannon before the election. This is a leaked audio before Election Day 2020. Bannon saying that Trump planned to falsely claim victory. Let me just play this because, again, this is before the actual election day. And Steve Bannon knew that Donald Trump would, if he had to, lie about the election, would refuse to accept the results of the election. Let's just play this.
More of our people vote early that count. Theirs voted mail. And so they're going to have a natural disadvantage, and Trump's going to take advantage of it. That's our strategy. He's going to declare himself a winner. So when you wake up Wednesday morning, it's going to be a firestorm. You're going to have Antifa crazy, the media crazy, the courts are crazy, and Trump's going to be sitting there mocking, tweeting shit out. You lose. I'm the winner. I'm the king. And he'll be all over. He'll be going, where's Hunter? Is Hunter on a crack pipe? I mean, no, he'll be, because then it doesn't matter. Remember, here's the thing. After then, Trump never has to go to a voter again. He's going to fire Wray, the FBI director, and fire the he's going to say, fuck you. How about that? Because he's never going to, he's done his last election. Oh, he's going to be off the chain. He's going to be crazy. Also, if Trump is losing by 10 or 11 o'clock at night, it's going to be even crazier. Because he's going to sit right there and say they stole it.
Agree.
I'm directing the Attorney General to shut down all ballot places in all 50 states. It's going to be no. He's not going out easy. If Biden's winning, Trump is going to do some crazy shit.
Yeah, Bill, Trump did some crazy shit because that's who Donald Trump is. It's fascinating to me that Steve Bannon understood even before a single vote was counted how Donald Trump would behave, what he would do.
And of course, Steve Bannon approves of it and thinks that's just, and the people who were there with him, I suppose, I don't know who they are laughing at that thought. I hadn't heard that clip before. I'd seen it referenced on Twitter and elsewhere. And Heather Cox Richardson, the historian, very popular, I guess we don't call them blogs anymore or whatever,
newsletter,
thing on Substack, very intelligent actually, said that she listened to it, I saw this on Twitter, and was in a white-hot fury at these people sort of relishing the thought of the civil disorder, but also overturning an election and just, overturning self-government in this country when so many people had fought and died for it over the decades and centuries. And I guess that's what I feel listening to this now. She says something like, that they thought for them it's just a game. And I think I understand what she's saying. She's right about that, but it's actually worse than even that, because there are cynical political operatives. It's a game, and they cut some corners and take advantage. For them, I'd say overturning the sort of norms and of a constitutional democracy, the rule of law, that's not sort of a bug, right? That's a feature. That's the politics they want. And Trump, doesn't think this through the way some of his intellectual defenders do, but it's not just that they aren't willing to fight hard for the rule of law and for constitutional democracy. They disdain it and sort of despise it. And that's we've never had a president, I don't think, who was willing to go there. And so many supporters who were willing to go there. And still, a year and a half later, people who are more respectable, who claim to care about democracy and the rule of law and the Constitution, who are not willing to call out these people as unacceptable. For me, that's what's also a year and a half later, we're learning everything we're learning. 49% of the Republican electorate says they want Trump as the nominee in 2024. And, the respectable conservatives and establishment Republicans kind of prefer that he not be the nominee, but certainly don't think he should be disqualified or even opposed vigorously. Wall Street Journal is just busy warning that, Trump's just hurting our chances a little bit here in 2022, and maybe he wouldn't be the strongest candidate in 2024. I mean, how pitiful is that?
But we've gotten used to it. I mean, this is the pattern here. And I think this is a very important point. And I think the Bannon soundbite just sort of clarifies this, that all of the actual claims of fraud are just pretexts.
Mhm.
That really what has been internalized is this refusal to accept the outcome of the election. So in other words, the big lie is, I mean, nobody actually believes the big lie because there's nothing there, but that doesn't matter. It's actually worse than believing the big lie. It's believing that, it's more important that we cling to power and that we keep these other guys out of power. And when you start to realize what that means, it is that in fact, these folks are already post-democracy. They are already post-constitutional government. And all of the arguments, all of the rationalizations, are just sort of plugged into that larger abandonment of the American project. And that ought to be alarming to people. And it ought to be alarming to the people who've been sitting on the sidelines and done nothing. So I have another just random thought here. Remind me to ask you about Watergate, because I've been thinking a lot about all of this. The other thing that I thought was really extraordinary about yesterday was, speaking of Steve Bannon, that Trump spoke to Bannon twice on January 5th, the day before. This was the day that Bannon then, apparently after talking to Trump himself, says all hell is going to break loose tomorrow. It's all converging, and now we're on, as they say, the point of attack tomorrow. I'll tell you this, it's not going to happen like you think it's going to happen. It's going to be quite extraordinarily different. All I can say is strap in. Now, this is Steve Bannon after talking to the president, who obviously was on board with all of that. So, I mean, there are so many other dazzling details about this testimony that we heard yesterday, including the fact that, once again, all of the most damaging evidence is coming from inside Trump world itself. I mean, everybody we're hearing from was either a Trumpist or Trump adjacent, which I think is immensely important. And I think it's great that the former aides are now testifying, but I can't shake the thought. I don't want to dwell on this for a long time, but I can't shake the thought. Why didn't they take public action between December 14th and January 6th to stop what was about to happen? Why didn't more of them speak out during impeachment? Why did they wait until now? I kind of wonder what history's verdict is going to be. I mean, great, Pat Cipollone is, doing the right thing. He's clearly ready to testify. But there were a lot of these guys who were in a position to do something much earlier, and they didn't. And I just kept thinking about that over and over and over again. Where have they been for the last year and a half?
Yeah.
Where were they then?
Where were they then? Where were they between November 3rd and January 6th?
Yeah.
Where were they during impeachment and the trial in the Senate, when we could have, I think, brought home to voters how unbelievably bad Trump's behavior was? Again, as you say, really hostile to the American project, not just kind of a sore loser having a little bit of a hissy fit, right? But they didn't bring that home to the American public. If anything, they just kept quiet. All the rationalizers went around rationalizing. All the accommodators went around accommodating. And here we are a year and a half later with a much greater ongoing problem than I think we needed to have. I mean, it was never going to go away. And 4 years of Trump as president did a lot of damage. And God knows you and I have spoken enough about how the Republican Party is deeply corrupted and conservatism and so forth. But the failure to kind of shut the door on right after January 6th, and to really bring home the lesson, and to have some people say, you know what, I was wrong. And they're still not saying it. I still come back to that. I mean, we still have, shouldn't some person stand up today, one member of Congress, one member of Congress, say, I have now watched these hearings. I have now listened to the tape of Steve Bannon and read the accounts of the meetings in the White House. This man cannot be president again. I am going to spend the next 2 years supporting other people. This will be a Republican in the Republican primaries against Trump. I'll support whoever can, if they want to say it this way, whoever has the best chance to defeat Donald Trump. But we could not nominate him. And if nominated, we cannot vote for him because he cannot be president of the United States again. Will anyone say that?
Well, so far not. They may be saying it in private, but we're used to that. So can we talk about Brad Parscale? Because he had this temporary flash of conscience, which seems to be a thing. So he recognized on January 6th, he recognized the impact of the speech immediately, and so he's texting back and forth with Katrina Pearson, who had been the spokesman for Trump, and said this is about Trump pushing for uncertainty in our country, a sitting president asking for civil war, and then he said this week I feel guilty for helping him win, which he didn't, and Pearson responds, "You did what you felt right at the time, therefore it was right," and Pascal then adds, "Yeah, but a woman is dead. And yeah, if I was Trump and I knew my rhetoric killed someone," and then Katrina Pearson says, "It wasn't the rhetoric." And Pascal says, "Katrina, yes, it was." Now, the extraordinary thing about that is he is still working for Donald Trump. So he got over it. Yesterday we talked with Mark Leibovich about the people who, had caved into Donald Trump. Tim Miller's got the New York Times bestselling book, Why We Did It. But it's still extraordinary to watch this process where you're looking at this is the man that I supported whose rhetoric has killed someone. And yet a few days later, he's totally back on board again. I mean, what the hell?
And isn't he already sucking up to Trump just a month later? As I think I
Yep.
saw some email he sends to Trump about, you're the man, and you've been impeached twice, and let's go for a third time. And he's kind of sucking up, making sure he stays on or gets back on the payroll, which of course he's happily on right now. And he's
Yeah.
doing well. This is again the point at one point that one just has to come to grips with. They have paid very little price. The accommodators, the rationalizers, not just that, but the actual Steve Bannon. I mean, has any of them? I mean, he may be in some legal trouble now, though, as he got pardoned, and as of yet, he's a free person making a good living, I'm sure, off of his podcast or whatever that is. And this is true of all of them. They're doing well. They've paid very little price. Almost no one has gone to jail. It's not like Watergate in that respect. And that's very dangerous, I think, incidentally. That makes it more dangerous, I guess is the way I would put it. One thing to have to go through this, another thing not even to call people on it afterwards, but a third thing, as it were, where people are sort of flourishing a year and a half later. What lesson does that send to people?
Well, it sends a very powerful signal. So I'm not to dwell too much on this, but, here is Brad Parscale, who was the campaign manager on January 6th, says that, Trump killed somebody with his rhetoric. He's calling for a civil war. I feel guilty about this. Literally 1 month later, February 6th, 2021, you just mentioned this, he tweets out a statement to Trump. If they only impeached you twice, you need to run again, because to change the system, you have to kick it in the ass. I would love to be the only president to be impeached 3 times because history remembers those that didn't conform. I'm in, are you? So 1 month later, of course, this follows, Kevin McCarthy going down to Mar-a-Lago, and there is this pattern. Okay, so the day after another extraordinary January 6th committee. Bill, you mentioned this earlier, but I think it's worth just mentioning that this committee is really a surprise. I mean, they are getting better, I think, as they go along. I think they are learning. I think that this has been much more consequential than people thought. And Kevin McCarthy's just got to be kicking himself, and others can join in as well, kicking him, not to have any representation on this committee. This committee is turning out to be more important, to have more impact than really anybody expected. Do you agree?
Right. I mean, David Brooks, my former colleague at the Weekly Standard, wrote a column in the New York Times the day before the first committee hearing. So what would that have been? Very late June, only, 3 weeks ago, I think. Oh, that's too late. It's not, they're too partisan. It's not going to make any difference. It's not going to work. That was kind of the conventional wisdom of a certain kind of world-weary pundit who, doesn't think any politician can ever stand up and make a difference by what he or she does. No, I think the committee has been in an era when we're so used to seeing our politicians underperform. Our institutions are broken. Congress, God knows, doesn't work at all, right?
Yeah, at all.
To have an actual institution of Congress work well, work effectively, and the individuals on it behave impressively and admirably, and up to and including, I would say in this case, the Speaker of the House, Nancy Pelosi, who insisted that put Liz Cheney on the committee. That was maybe an easy call. Made her vice chair. That would probably raise some hackles among her own party. Then insisted, I take it she's really the one making these decisions. Chairman Benny Thompson deserves credit for implementing them and going along too, but insisted that she have a central role. You can only imagine, like I was joking with a Democrat the other day about this. Can you imagine the conversations in private with a huge number of ambitious, and some of them quite impressive, incidentally, younger, Democrats who, have been involved in the impeachments and have been fighting Trump for 5 years and so forth. And suddenly they're told, hey, if you're on the committee, you get to question for, half of one hearing. If you're not, maybe there's not room for you on the committee because Cheney and Kinzinger are on it. And Liz Cheney is going to be the star of this whole process. And that's very important for the country. Nancy Pelosi saw very early on. It's effective politically for her, obviously, as well, for the Democrats, but really important for the country. The discipline with which they've done that, the lack of grumbling. I'm sort of amazed there haven't been
This is
stories
very
with,
interesting. Yeah.
people saying, well, hey, she was not, to be honest, I mean, Liz Cheney was not on board much of the criticism, at least publicly, of Trump before November 3rd, 2020. So how come she's this, the heroine of this committee? But it's to Pelosi's credit, it's to Thompson's credit. I think Jamie Raskin and others on the committee clearly are working in a collegial way with her. So I think it's an instance where, but as you say more broadly, it's somewhat reassuring that the system can sort of work, I mean, to some degree, that individual politicians can subordinate their own egos a little bit to the common good, that someone like Liz Cheney can demonstrate true courage and impressive leadership, and we'll see what happens politically in Wyoming, but she's getting credit from an awful lot of people. So it is, I agree, the committee is a sort of a bit of a bright light here in an otherwise somewhat gloomy landscape.
No, and the point about Nancy Pelosi's decision to put her on that committee and have her play a leading role shows the ability to adapt, because they didn't do this during impeachment number one or impeachment number two. They did not include any Republicans on that team, and yet you do have people on the Twitter left. You have people like Don Winslow, who gone on these massive Twitter tears attacking Liz Cheney, and of course Mark Elias, the Democratic attorney, is obsessed with attacking Adam Kinzinger and Liz Cheney. But that's not reflected in what's going on with the Democrats in Congress. Also, Jamie Raskin gave an interview to the New York Times the other day where I think he understands that in the fight against authoritarianism, that progressives need to make alliances with the center right, that is the history, that you must actually reach out to the center right to fight against the authoritarian impulse. And he understands that lesson of history, that lesson of politics. And I think that that's one of the reasons why this committee has been so successful. All right, so I've been thinking about Watergate a lot lately, and you and I are both old enough to remember that in real time. Can anyone make the case? Has anyone tried to make the case that Watergate was more serious than this coup attempt in terms of presidential scandals? I mean, when you think about what Watergate was, it was a break-in, it was an attempt of dirty tricks, it was a cover-up, it was the smoking gun was the president of the United States talking about misusing the CIA to cover up his crimes. But how does that compare to what we now know Donald Trump did? Does anyone make the case that Watergate, which resulted in the resignation of the president and the criminal conviction of many, many, many members of the Nixon administration, was actually more serious than what we are confronting right now? Wouldn't you like to hear Hugh Hewitt on this question?
Yeah, he worked at the Nixon. He worked for President Nixon in one of his first
Oh,
jobs out of
he's a
college.
big Nixon turd polisher. So I mean,
Yeah, so he
he'd
should.
have to decide which turd does he want to polish more aggressively. And Hugh has the capability of doing both, but I would be interested to hear his take on this.
No, I think, look, I very much agree with that. And I just, so to flip it to a forward look, one of the problems, Watergate did result in the resignation of President Trump. Isn't in that kind of position. But the analogy would be he's totally out of play in politics. That the idea of nominating Trump in 2024 should be as crazy, as out of bounds, as disreputable as the idea of nominating Richard Nixon for another term in 1980 would have been, right? I mean, you don't have to persecute the guy necessarily. You don't maybe pardon him or don't prosecute him criminally. He gets to have a nice retirement and meet with people if he wishes. But it's at least as bad, and I would say worse than Watergate. And the really bad thing is that Trump is not in retirement as Nixon was. No one, people who aided and abetted him have mostly not been punished yet. We'll see what happens. And, certainly politically, it hasn't become something that you have to say, no, that can't happen again. And Congress passed a ton of reforms. Some of them probably went a little far, or they were not thought through correctly in terms of the FBI and the CIA, but did a ton of institutional reforms. And after Watergate, to try to prevent it from happening again, they tried to strengthen the guardrails. They may not have done so always, as I say, in the most brilliant way, but it probably on net did strengthen the guardrails. I came to Washington in '85, and we were got lectures. We're getting careful. You can't do this. This is why people in 10, 15 years before went to jail, because they used federal government authorities to pursue a political partisan agenda and so forth. Obviously, most of us hopefully weren't going to do that anyway, but it was a live thing. It was a warning. Congress hasn't passed any legislation. They haven't passed the Electoral Count
nothing.
Act. They haven't passed the kind of presidential reforms, pardon powers, and that sort of thing that Bob Bauer and Jack Goldsmith write about, protecting the Justice Department from abuse, there's a lot that could be done. And that part of it is bad. And that's where the system is not reacting in as healthy a way, you could argue, as it did in Watergate.
Well, now hindsight is 2020, and I mentioned this on one of the cable shows the other day, and I got no attention for it whatsoever or traction. And I understand maybe it's annoying to just to say what should have been, but as I think about Watergate, I think about the role that the special prosecutor Leon Jaworski played, federal judge John Sirica
Mm-hmm.
played. And that's the big difference. In retrospect, I think it was a big mistake for the Biden administration not to appoint a special counsel on all of this, a special prosecutor, because now we have this quite, this reluctance to move more quickly. Had there not been a special prosecutor in Watergate, things would have been very, very different. If you didn't have John Sirica holding people's feet to the fire as part of federal criminal investigation, this would have been very, very different. But we don't have a Leon Jaworski. We don't have a John Sirica playing that role now. So, I mean, in retrospect, I don't want to join in the beating up on Merrick Garland. He's in a very difficult position, but you know that he's very, very reluctant to look like he's acting politically. Isn't that exactly why you appoint special counsels, so that you don't have that kind of consideration when you have the rule of law at stake?
Yeah, no, I tend to agree with that. And I think Sirica, if you've got the standard, kind of shorthand history of Watergate, gives the media a huge amount of credit, gives the Congressional Committee a huge amount of credit, sort of forgets that's how much Sirica, the actual trial that was going on, allowed Sirica to put pressure on people to flip, or allowed the prosecution to put pressure on people under a judge who wanted to see the truth come out to flip, and helped make the whole thing unravel as it did. And that was important. But the other point I'd make, just compounds confirms your point, is we also had a Republican Party then, after Nixon wins a massive reelection victory, not like Trump, a loser. And, is a serious person who's been in, God knows, in the party for 30 years, 40 years, 30 years, I guess, and, was a vice president for 8 years and so forth. And that, even so, you had a party then that was willing to go along with setting up the special committee for Watergate. There was a huge bipartisan vote for it, that was willing to let Howard Baker, as the as the senator, sort of be a responsible leader on it and work with Sam Ervin, and not just do what Kevin McCarthy has done, try to put on ridiculous people on the committee, or then boycott it. Liz Cheney is the equivalent, but there's Liz Cheney and Adam Kinzinger. That's two members. Howard Baker spoke, and the others spoke for a lot of members. And then they ended up with a third of the Republicans on the committee voting for the impeachment article. So not all Republicans obviously went along with that, but there was still a sense of country first, and we need to find out what's happened. And Congress has an oversight role and a legislative role. This is, again, where the utter collapse of the Republican Party and the conservative movement. I was in college, really, basically at the time, first year of grad school. How did I get to know about George Will and then about Bill Safire? Because they were two of the most prominent conservatives just beginning their writing careers then. Safire in the New York Times, when they had just started the op-ed page, I think a few years before, or brought in, non-New York Times writers to kind of become op-ed writers. And George Will with National Review then, actually, and then he begins his column in the Washington Post. I think he's just begun his column in the Washington Post in '74. And both of them are for getting to the truth about Watergate. They're the kind of two of the brightest young conservative writers. Nick and Safire had worked for Nixon, obviously. Yeah. So the degree to which, and National Review was mixed, they defended Nixon quite a lot, but a fair number of those people also said, no, the truth has to come out. So the degree to which we had a healthier Republican Party and a healthier conservative movement then is also worth noting.
All right, so let's shift gears a little bit. Bill, you have actually been highlighting the possible decoupling of some of the polls for some time. I mean, Joe Biden's numbers are just absolutely abysmal, but there does seem to be a gap between that and the generic numbers for Democrats. And so there's this new poll out this morning, asking people, what is your preference for the outcome of the 2022 congressional elections? 41% say Democratic control, 40% say Republican control, 19% say other, which again would suggest that the Democrats down ballot somehow are not paying as dramatic a price for Biden's numbers as one would expect at this point. What do you think is happening?
Yeah, I've been riding this hobby horse for a little while, and I think I was could be vindicated, at least in the short term. We'll see what happens, of course.
Yeah.
But I think I was right to notice this maybe 3-4 weeks ago, even that the generic ballot in the 538 kind of averaging of them, it was Republican plus 2.5, something like that. The generic congressional ballot in this poll, as you say, it's Democrats plus 1, a little better for the Democrats, and that Biden was way down in approval and sliding, and the generic ballot wasn't getting worse. So clearly, people are capable of saying, I disapprove of Joe Biden at his job performance as president, but I'm not so sure I'm going to vote Republican in the 2022 congressional election. It's not a ridiculous, incidentally, I don't know why people have such a hard time thinking that's like a crazy thing to think. And they're perfectly reasonable people who could say, maybe you and I might say it in some ways, incidentally, that we're not crazy about what Biden's doing as a president in every respect, but we are very reluctant to vote a Republican as a consequence. So I discussed this with Joe Trippi in a conversation. He's also been one of the Democratic strategists pushing this, and Simon Rosenberg as well, really trying to say that the conventional view is ultimately it's all about presidential approval. And there has been a high correlation historically. Ron Brownstein has a good piece about this today, walking through some of the correlations. And therefore, usually the presidential disapproval drags down the party in power, and there's a natural move anyway to be disappointed in the new people in the White House, especially if they also control Congress. And all of that means there's usually a bad performance, obviously, in the off-year election. But these rules, A, they don't apply 100%, and B, I think people have exaggerated how much of an iron rule it is, especially younger people who saw 2010 and then 2018, and they just think, well, that's always the way it happens. But we're in a new era. We have real extreme Republican candidates. Voters are capable of decoupling, I think, to some degree, their judgment of Biden and their vote in 2022. And if the issue becomes Republican extremism, a Trumpified Republican Party that's anti-democracy and also extreme on a bunch of actual issues, guns, abortion, perhaps others, and particularly extreme candidates in some of the key swing states running for Senate and for governor, you put all that together, voters are capable of as we say, as you said, and the term has become, I guess, used now, decoupling. So I don't know if that's going to happen. The sophisticated response to me, and you've discussed this, I think, on the podcast with others, Amy Walter makes this point and others, is the end of the day, September, October, the kind of the weight of Biden drags you down if you're a Democrat. You can outperform for now. The reason we call it a wave is that it breaks late, it comes late, and that is possible. That could happen. I mean, I could be sitting here thinking Democrats have a decent chance, pretty good chance actually, to hold the Senate, maybe pick up a seat or two, maybe an outside chance even to hold the House or make it close, win key governorships. And I could be just kidding myself, and the wave's going to break over me and everyone else on September 15th, and it's all going to be underwater. But I'm less confident that that's the case, because we're in such a new environment with the Trumpy Republicans, the extremism, Biden as a kind of a bridge to the future, but not really. The voters really think who they vote for the Senate. It's a judgment on Joe Biden. I kind of think, in a way, his being so little visible, it may end up helping the Democrats. Anyway, I think that's the interesting debate that's happening now.
We don't know what the rules of politics are anymore because everything has been changing so quickly. So one of the things this poll suggests is that we are watching a rather dramatic realignment of the electorate in real time. Let me just read you a couple of paragraphs from the Times article. The confluence of economic problems and resurgent cultural issues has helped turn the emerging class divide in the Democratic coalition into a chasm, as Republicans appear to be making new inroads among non-white and working class voters, perhaps especially Hispanic voters, who remain more concerned about the economy and inflation than abortion rights and guns. But also, for the first time in a Times Siena national survey, Democrats had a larger share of support among white college graduates than among non-white voters, a striking indication of the shifting balance of political energy in the Democratic coalition. As recently as the 2016 congressional elections, Democrats won more than 70% of non-white voters while losing among white college graduates. So Again, it's too soon to say how this is going to play out, whether we're engaging in wish casting here. But there is a dramatic shift among the electorate, and the Republicans have clearly, I think, are probably going to be losing white college graduates for a generation. The danger, though, is that Democrats are going to be losing the working class, that they've just simply forgotten how to talk to working class voters, including non-white working class
Yeah, I
voters.
mean, the conversation I had with Joe Trippi, last part of it, is alarm about the Democrats not being in touch with an awful lot of America and so forth. So there are many cross currents at this point. We have two parties that have unstable coalitions, I think is the right way to think about it, in a new political
Right.
environment, uncharted waters. So it's foolish to assume that any model from the past necessarily holds. I think an awful lot is up in the air. A lot depends on these particular candidates in particular states and the salience of the democracy issue and other issues, as opposed perhaps to inflation. So I think it's a very interesting and provocative moment. And I think that's true going forward. I think it's very foolish to think that we know what's going to happen in 2023 or 2024 in either party at this point.
So I actually I'm debating whether or not to write this, but clearly, Joe Biden is, facing the low point of his presidency. He's about 33%, at least one major survey approval rating. You have these open questions about his age. The Democratic coalition appears to be fracturing. The Democrats do, with their circular firing squad, what they often do, and they're aiming at Joe Biden. But it strikes me that the one thing that might save the Joe Biden presidency would be an early announcement of Donald Trump's candidacy. And by that I mean that right now, generically, Republicans are clearly in a strong position against Joe Biden, with the exception of Donald Trump. And the moment that Donald Trump announces, it becomes exactly the binary choice that Joe Biden needs to have something to contrast. You may not like the fact that I'm shuffling around and I'm gaffe prone, but here's the alternative, and it becomes unavoidable. And the Republican Party then has to make the decision, are we still going to go with Trump right now, or are we going to turn the page? So I actually am kind of interested to see two things. Number one, when Republicans, take control of the House, which I think is, pretty much inevitable, how far are they going to go in overreaching? And my prediction is there's no limit. They're going to overreach. They will be on display. They have no governing philosophy. And when Donald Trump announces that he's running, things become much more stark and much clearer. And if there is a path for Joe Biden, that's what it would look like.
I'll even go further than you, maybe, and say just two footnotes almost. One, I think Trump is more likely than not to announce this year that he's running for president in 24. I think he has a lot of incentives to do so, including suppressing any erosion among upper sort of wealthier Republicans, establishment sort of Republicans away from Trump towards DeSantis. Clearly, there's some of that going on. I think the Times poll itself shows that among college-educated Republicans, donors and so forth. So I think Trump has some incentive to try to kind of freeze the race, also maybe takes care of some of his legal problems. He can say he's a candidate. Anyway, I don't think it wouldn't be at all surprised if Trump announced around Labor Day. Doesn't that affect the 2022 elections, perhaps? Doesn't it make it even easier then for Democrats to say this is about a Trump Republican Party? My opponent, whoever in Pennsylvania or Ohio or Wisconsin or Arizona, won't denounce Donald Trump. That's the choice here. It's about Trump. It's not about Biden. I have my issues with Biden. I'm not going to go be a rubber stamp for Biden, but we need to not put Republicans in control, extremist Republicans in control of this Congress. My second point, and this is further out there, is Biden should announce at some point, in my opinion, that he's not running for a second term. Incidentally, if Biden announced this tomorrow, having listened to this podcast tonight, wouldn't his numbers go up like 10 points? I mean, wouldn't everyone say, you know what, that's great. He's focusing on inflation, Ukraine, being a good president, a one-term president.
Yeah.
The key
Here
formulation.
comes lame duck, though.
Lame duck, but he's already a lame. What is he not lame about? What's not lame about it now at 33%? He's got to say, I can be a successful one-term president. I'm going to break the pattern where people feel they have to run again. I'm going to be a successful one-term president. Fresh new generation, outsiders, governors, younger members of Congress, blah, blah, blah. They should all run at 24. You're not. Some people aren't quite where I am on this. Trippi actually isn't, because he's too worried about circular firing squad among the Dems in 23. I take that point, but I'm very intrigued by the notion of a next generation moderate Democratic nominee in 24. And I think Biden would help himself and the party to basically say, I'm going to be a successful one-term president, but a one-term president.
Oh, Bill, see, I feel a Bill Kristol op-ed coming.
Yeah, okay.
You need to write this. I think you need to like lay out that particular case, because that's, and to the extent that the Democratic Party is going to have to wrestle with that future, they need to start now.
I will write it, but since so many people listen to this podcast and it moves numbers, it moves voters, it moves Biden administration officials, it moves it moves Governor Polis and various members of Congress out there to think, yeah, maybe I should do that. I may just let the Charlie Sykes podcast have the influence that it really has.
All right. And thank you so much for coming back on the podcast. We always love having you, Bill.
My pleasure.
The Bulwark podcast is produced by Katie Cooper with audio production by Jonathan Siri. I'm Charlie Sykes. Thank you for listening to today's Bulwark podcast, and we'll be back tomorrow to do this all over again.
Hey guys, I'm Tom Welling. I used to play Clark Kent on Smallville.
I'm Michael Rosenbaum. I used to play Lex Luthor on Smallville. Join us every week as we go back.
Way back.
I'm excited.
I know.
Are you?
Can't wait.
Join Tom Welling and Michael Rosenbaum every week as they rewind every episode of Smallville and discuss their experiences with friends, fans, and co-stars. Talkville, the ultimate Smallville podcast. Listen anywhere you get your podcasts or watch on YouTube.